What's up, everybody? Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the most illustrious and only New York Knicks draft podcast, Draft Strickland, at least until friend of the pod, Chris Persianen, kicks his draft up again later in this year. We're on season 4, episode 2, with a very special first-time guest, somebody we haven't had on before, but if you don't know about him, you're going to be happy you tuned in. And by the end of this episode, hopefully you'll be following this person and their podcast and everything like that. It's one of my favorite newer-ish follows on Draft Twitter. I don't know when you joined Draft Twitter, but you were newer on my radar, and just really enjoy all the commentary, analysis, analytics, all that shit that you bring to the table. Even though you're a Heat fan, which is just something that just shows you how
I see the stream commentary, very authentic.
Yeah, exactly. This is how we do it here. It's Eli, my colleague here, Eli from the Culture Chatter podcast. You can find him on Twitter at Flawless Like Eli. And you can find the Culture Chatter podcast on Twitter. Just look for the name of that podcast. On Twitter, Eli tweets, writes, shares information about the draft, about the NFL, apparently, also about the Miami Heat. So check him out, give him a follow, subscribe to their pod if you're into the draft. Eli, what's up, man? How you doing?
Yeah, man, I'm doing great. You mentioned the recent NFL tweets. That's normally like not the biggest diet of the tweets, but obviously it's wintertime, playoff time. A lot of teams recently punched their way to the playoffs, so there's a few of those, but it's mostly NBA and prospect adjacent content, and obviously a lot of content about the Miami Heat, who your Knicks have a little thing, I guess. I don't think it's very mutual, but
no, we won't talk about the playoff series, or maybe we will talk about it a little bit, but yeah, I'm definitely not bitter or petty about it at all. Yeah, no, I had your Twitter in front of me, and I was just scrolling down just to be professional, and then I saw this football shit, and I was like, oh, let me find out, because I think there's actually a pretty big intersection in like draft Twitter and like NBA draft Twitter and NFL draft Twitter. I mean, it's the NFL, right? Like, I'm probably the exception here in like the Strickland crew. I'm like the one person who doesn't give a flying fuck about the NFL. So good for you if you're doing your thing out here, looking at multiple sports and all that shit. I know my normal pod Strickland co-host Schwinn is a big Bills guy, and I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to also promote the Strickland's newest podcast, Strictly NFL, which you should totally check out, even though I don't, because I don't care about the NFL. So listeners, check that out if you haven't subscribed to it. But yeah, so we could really just get right into it. I was really excited, people, to have Eli on, not just because he knows a lot about this year's class and he has a really interesting perspective on just looking at prospects, but I think the Heat and Knicks are kind of in funny and sort of similar positions with regards to the draft. The Heat have their main superstars, right? The Knicks have their main stars. The Heat have their main role players for the most part, although some of them left, and I'm sure they're in the process of molding other various random white boys into stud contributors as we speak. But like, they're still looking for, the next draft picks who aren't in the top 5 who can end up contributing, right? It's something the Heat have done multiple times. Bam wasn't a top pick. Tyler Hero wasn't a top pick. And other contributors on the team were, late picks, undrafted free agent signings, things like that. So they make as much of a use of the draft as any other team. Jaime Jaquez is doing his thing out here. I can't hate, right? We only got so many Latinos in the NBA, so I'm like obligated to show a little bit of support for my guy. And he was, a perfect example of a player who I honestly kind of wrote off. Like he's one of those players who, if I wasn't doing this for shits and giggles, I probably would have spent more time on him, but I'm not, and I'm lazy. So I was just like, it doesn't seem like I should spend that much time on this guy who the Knicks aren't going to pick. And then he ended up being nice. So joke's on me, right? So, yeah, I don't know. I guess before we get into this year's draft, like, I just want to kind of pick your brain a bit on like, what is your perspective on how the Heat have handled the draft? Because like, it's always different when you're a fan of the team and you have a microscope on each pick and you're analyzing these things with a fine-tooth comb, and it's easy to be like, oh yeah, Bam Adebayo, Tyler Hero. But you mentioned to me previously that like there were a couple times the Heat either whiffed, or if they didn't whiff, like they passed on obvious players who were better. Or so like, what is your evaluation of like how the Heat draft, like both what they look for and how good they are at the draft?
So I think like the first part of that, what they look for is relatively obvious. I know you have your own thing. Knicks draft targets. Is it Perrin? What is the exact
Oh
formula?
yeah, the parent formula named after our assistant GM and lead of amateur scouting, Walt Perrin.
Yeah, I don't have a cool name like that, but I do know that just from some of the selections historically, that the Heat really value touch. They really value intangibles or good interviewing or um, whatever exactly you want to call it.
Heat
And they
culture.
culture. I want to stay away from that word just because people kind of like hate it, and it is like it does evict like a certain it does evict a certain arrogance, but culture. Let's go with culture. Guys that kind of fit said culture, um, in terms of their personalities. Guys who you know have a history of working hard, or people around them consider them hard workers. But touch is a big thing. Obviously, general shooting ability. Some of the picks go against that, but they had decent or relevant shooting indicators from certain ranges. Whether that's you know they were good in the mid range, or they shot a decent percentage from the free throw line, or their diet of 3 point attempts wasn't the cleanest in terms of shot quality. And I think they're not really. It seems like they're not the biggest on getting some of these guys like really big wingspans. Almost every Heat pick that's not Bam who's a big. They've had like neutral or like +1, +2 wingspans, whether that's Jovic, whether that's Tyler. Hami's wingspan isn't particularly long. Um, a pick we won't name has a decent wingspan. He's actually on the Knicks, which is
Wait,
hilarious.
well, time out. Who do you mean? Maybe I've had too long of a day. I don't.
Oh, a New Jersey native, Precious Achua.
Oh, Precious. I
Yeah,
forgot the y'all drafted Precious. That's right. Yeah,
Precious
yes.
has
No shit.
Precious has like a 7'1" wingspan. He's kind of the only historical example I can think of off the top of my head who's like a big wingspan guy. But I think kind of there is kind of a correlation between like touch and neutral wingspan. A lot of the floater
Mhm.
heavy guys aren't like big wingspan guys, so maybe that's the reason. And then I think just like general off ball field players that played in roles where they were either playing off of someone or they were uh, playing next to another creator, and they just have like general feel for relocation or general feel for playing off of screens and curls. Um, and that's definitely Tyler's role with Kentucky, and that was certainly Jovic's role at Mega, and that was um, outside of like the post up stuff where he's like the primary. That was definitely early UCLA Hami's role. So I think those are like the things they're looking for, right? They're high character, touch indicators, off ball field, right? I think that's about what they're looking for. And in terms of the hit rate on that, I think the last few years, especially, when we've had picks, I would say that the Heat have done relatively well. I mean, I can't really think of one that's like outside of Precious is like objectively a miss, and it's not like we developed Precious, right? So I can't even really comment on that. After the Winslow pick, which was in 2015, we didn't have a pick in 2016. This is first rounders. But first round picks, Bam, Tyler Hero, redacted, Nikola Jovic, and Hami Harkless, and all of them are on the team right now. And I think Jovic is his development is coming along a little slower than like Hami, but he also came in a lot younger. He was like a
Super
teenager.
young.
He was a teenager all of last year and just recently turned 20, I believe. And he's had like a pretty big physical transformation. He's gone from like super skinny, ball handler forward type of guy to like he's kind of like a kind of still has some of those wingy skills, but he's kind of like in terms of build, kind of like traditionally a forward, and developing those movement skills in a new body will be
I saw
important. So,
some tweet that said he was 240. That seems
you said what was the
generous.
number?
240?
I think he's huge. I'm not gonna lie. He's probably
Really? Dang.
he's 240 might be gas, but he is 6'10". I'd imagine
He's a
like if
big
he
dude. Like
stands
he's
next
tall, yeah.
if he stands next to Caleb or not Caleb, if he stands next to Kevin, um, he probably doesn't look as big, but he's a little bit taller than Kevin. So I don't know.
It might
I
be
think
because his face is still like 15 years old.
yeah, he does look really young, but I think Jovic is in that range, which is like he put on like 30 pounds. Like that's in an off season. That's kind of a huge physical transformation, and we're hoping that it leads to the proper role transformation. Just because I'd imagine other teams would have assessed him as like this creator type prospect that a lot of people on draft Twitter, especially after the FIBA World Cup U19 stuff. Um, I think I think a lot of people seen him as kind of a creator. I think that he kind of assessed him as like the future for next to Bam. So we'll see when it comes to the Jovic, but I think Hami is. You can argue he's Hame. I'm sorry. You could argue he's already hit. Obviously, Bam is a hit, and Tyler Hero is a good basketball player for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I may like what he was what like what do you remember what pick he was? He was
18, right
18.
after
So like
um JHS for Lakers.
that's right. Yeah, so like I'm pretty confident saying he's a rotation player, and like I don't know if reasonable people can differ on whether that's a hit. I'm pretty sure you can say that's not a bust at the very least, which is pretty good for 18. Just because anytime you get a rotation player in the back half of the first is, even though sometimes it's kind of boring, that's a dub. So that's good news. And there's definitely a little upside there because he can do a lot of things. And another thing that kind of stands out to me for the Heat prospects, including Precious, even though with Precious it was more theoretical than actual, is like they pick guys who seem like they can be versatile. Tyler's not really versatile on defense, but he's very versatile on offense. And then all the other players are, in theory, or actually pretty versatile on both ends, right? Like Jovic, like one of the ideas was like, okay, he's skinny now, but that's because he's a baby. And once he gains strength, then like I don't know if he can play small ball 5, but maybe he can. But he could play 4, and maybe he could guard down a position or so and guard up in a pinch. And Jaime is another one who's like, he's not going to get all defense, but he's really fucking strong. And that is just as much a key to versatility on defense as length. And I feel like another thing the Knicks do that the Heat also take advantage of, I feel like strength is actually an underrated quality in prospects. Like wingspan gets all the love and all the shine, right? And we always talk about like, oh, blah blah blah, the +2 or a +3. And for shits, a couple months ago, I looked up like all defense players who aren't centers in the last couple years, and most of them don't have good wingspans. They're like plus a little tiny bit.
Yeah, Jimmy doesn't have a good wingspan at all.
Jimmy doesn't have a good wingspan. Caruso doesn't have a good wingspan. Drew doesn't have a good wingspan. None of these motherfuckers have a good wingspan except like OG and like a couple of there's obviously like it's not like having a long wingspan is not helpful. Obviously it's helpful, but like I think the key to being versatile is like you got to be strong, right? And we see that shit all the time. Like you can be a long defender, but if you're a twig, a lot of these guys are gonna move you. Like what doesn't matter whether they're like guard size like Brunson or wing size like Brunson or not Brunson or like Jimmy Butler or fucking Julius Randle army tank size. Like all these guys are moving you out the way for the most part. Like you got to be strong. The thing that makes OG crazy is he's long and strong. So like, being able to take a guy like Jovic and be like, he's skinny now, but we can see him adding 20, 30 pounds or whatever. And then even with Precious, like the whole theory of him was like, he's a 5 who's undersized, but maybe he gets stronger. He has some ball skills. He can sort of shoot if you squint. We could see him developing the shot. None of those things came to bear in real life, unfortunately.
The shot did kind of.
The shot did kind of. And I was really annoyed because I predicted that he was going to shoot well. And part of that was like, his shot does look good, but part of that was also like, he's from the Bronx, so I just need him to shoot for my own like mental health, so I can just say that. And in his Knicks tenure, he has 1 3, so that's a good start. He's, I think, 1 for 2 from 3, so I don't care what he did in Toronto. I'm going to give him a new chance to shoot. But anyway, I don't want to go down too big of a Precious tangent, but like he's a versatile guy who, in theory, you could project to add strength. In reality, he didn't add that much strength. So for either because he couldn't or because he wouldn't. So the versatility thing, I think, is really key. So to, kind of take it to this year's draft, like I do want to talk about if there's any prospects who have those kind of touch indicators, who might have some level of versatility or ability to gain strength, who you've seen. But before we get into the particular players, one more just like kind of high level question on how you view this draft, the 2024 draft. Online, a lot of people will say this draft sucks, especially compared to last year's draft, which I feel like is kind of not fair, but it's also true. You can ask different people, but like it's probably at least 10 people who from last year's draft who I'd be like, yeah, easy number 1 in this year's class. But
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, which is wild to say. And I mean, it is what it is, though. That's just how the cookie crumbles. But like, there's 2 ways you could view that. Like, the first way is in a draft where the top 10 is crazy, then all of a sudden you have guys like Alex Sarr, who in this year's draft might be number 1 or 2 or 3. He might be going 10 or 11 or 12. So that necessarily makes the middle of the draft stronger. So I think that is the theory where you get some people who say like, no, this draft just sucks. And it's just like an unqualified statement. And then there's some people like Sam Vecini, and I think I lean towards this as well a little bit, which is like the top of the draft is weak, but like if you're picking like 16 this year versus 16 last year versus 16 the year before, like it's probably not that huge of a difference. And you could choose a different number, right? That's lower, like 20 or 22 or something like that. So I know it's early and guys' stock will continue to change as, colleges get into like conference tournament play and March Madness and everything. But how are you feeling about this class? Not just the top, but like the rest of it.
I think I might be the only person to come up here and be like, it's not that bad. Like maybe that's my like affinity to be a contrarian, but I truly think that the top of the class is weak relative to other years, right? Especially last year. But last year, you could argue last year is one of the stronger top 3, 4, 5s, whatever. If you extend it
Ever.
to like in a wow, obviously even beyond Wimby, like if you remove Wimby and you
Mm-hmm.
just throw out Scoot, Almond. I know some people like Cam Whitmore in that range, Asar. Like these are players um, with multiple plus skills, invaluable archetypes. You don't find that in every draft, right? So I think the difference between this draft and that draft is that there are players um, with like multiple or 2 or 3, even plus skills, but they're in archetypes that are unique, right? They're in archetypes that are like the ideal developmental circumstance for them aren't very common, right? I think Ron Holland, like relative to frame plus strength, in my opinion, plus reaction time, and like plus explosion, whether that's like vertically, horizontally, or out of his first step. But he is, skinny wing, handling challenge, shooting challenge, etc., etc. There's a there. I do think that you may disagree. I know you had him low on your board. I do think there is a world and a possibility where he shoots, where he's driving more confidently, where he's you
Totally.
know making reads out of drives, and if he's doing that with his explosion, he's not RJ Barrett. Like he can no offense, he can actually win off the
We're no
bounce.
we're no strangers to slandering RJ Barrett on this website, okay?
he can he can actually win off the bounce with straight line speed, and he has more than enough um explosion vertically, especially like as a horizontal leaper. He like jumps way outside of the restricted area all the time, and he just always two-hand jams. And I think that's probably like his best trait as a leaper, like power generation off of 1 foot in a way he kind of just floats in the air. I don't even think he gets like super high, but um
Long
so I
jump.
think I think uh like there is a world where Ron is like an all-star or a low-end all-star, but that world takes a circumstance where he has somebody that's on the defensive end. He has somebody that's a defensive communicator and a coach that will hold him accountable. That's not really happening with Ignite. And historically, he's been that kind of guy. Duncanville,
Right.
high quality team. They won 3 state championships. He was a big part of that. But I do think that that's something that he needs if he's, obviously going to unlock all defensive potential. And then a system that doesn't put him in too many circumstances where he's running middle of the floor pick and roll, or he's directly
Tons of
in
decisions.
yeah, he's directly in a bunch of actions that you scheme against, but at the same time, a system that doesn't just stick him in a corner and you get your opportunities where you can. Like he's great in transition, but I don't think that you want to limit him to specifically that. So I think even though I'm higher on the high end outcome of Iran, I can understand why somebody is lower, just because the ideal developmental circumstances where there is enough usage available to where we can give you dribble handoffs and we can give you a single side and you can run a pick and roll. And we're simplifying your decision making, and but we're still like putting food on your plate. We're still giving you something to, get in game reps as a handler, get in game reps as a passer without putting too much on your plate. I don't know how if that situation exists. Is that Detroit? Is that San Antonio? You could argue um, it doesn't, which in that case you would be lower on him. And I think the same kind of applies with like Matas and kind of strength development.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Same with Sar, right? Where Sar plus touch, I think he might have like some of the best movement skills for
Totally.
a 5 or 5 adjacent type of player I've seen. Like it's like him and Mobley. He might be a better mover than Mobley though, because he's not as high hip. But his struggles with physicality are like super super prevalent, especially in a league like the NBL, where there are a lot of centers that aren't particularly tall or athletic, but they are burly. And I think that kind of shows up in his finishing numbers, where I think he's shooting like 60% at the rim or 62 or something like that, which is, if you just throw that out there, like if he was a wing, that would be fine, but he's not. And his
You
ideal
expect him
role.
to finish everything.
You said what?
I think he's the kind of prospect who you would expect would finish everything.
Yeah, like 7'5" wingspan, 7 foot, like 60,
Right.
62% isn't great. And obviously, I think historically, rim field goal percentage is like an indicator of bust. Like you look at guys with super low rim field goal percentages and super low free throw percentages, something that he has, and it's like bust, 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 bust. And I'm not calling it sorry bust because I think those are kind of okay. Those guys are usually bad in terms of touch, right? They don't have touch, but he has touch. Like him, like 50% of his mid range numbers right now. So I think that is more of an issue of like some of the core strength and concentration, um, and getting him, in a circumstance where he can develop as a four and get in game reps, but also, you know, develop in terms of strength is will be interesting, right? Is there a team currently other than maybe San Antonio where you can they kind of are on that arc with Wemby where you can envision him playing the four, but
Mm-hmm.
still developing five skills and getting stronger at the same time and like balancing those three things. So and a lot of these players don't have like good priors, right? Like we haven't seen these players dominate events after events after events. If you go on like Cerebro, for example, and go look at all of Jalen Suggs' events, um,
For people who
before.
don't know, listening, Cerebro is a software uh, and a company, which you may have heard of from old time friend of the pod, PD Webb, and uh, damn, I'm blanking on his other name. My guy, Rohan, I think his name was. Anyway, it's been a minute since they were on the pod, but Cerebro basically lets you compare how a player did at an quote unquote event, which is like it could be the NCAA tournament, it could be the NCAA season, it could be some Jordan brand sponsored tournament, it could be like the EYBL high school run, it could be college, it could be overseas, and they just the magic about Cerebro is they basically can grade out how much a player dominated in that event relative to that player's peers across events. So you can say like, oh, Shangun played in this league and in this league before he came into the NBA in Europe and absolutely dominated. He gets a gold. And Jalen Suggs played over here in America, in Minnesota, and in EYBL, and then in Gonzaga, and got a gold here, here, and here. And they both got golds, so they both must be really strong draft prospects, right? That kind of comparison. So what you're saying is, if you look at the Cerebro numbers for a lot of these guys, it's not that level of like
Yeah,
dominance before they got to this year.
yeah, it's a lot of bronze, bronze, bronze. And where I
Mm,
was going with the Jalen Suggs comparison is that you look at Jalen Suggs event by event, whether it was the UAA stuff or
mm-hmm.
it was the stuff with Mini Honda, just or Mini Ha. What is it?
I don't know,
Either
dude.
way,
I
either
just
way,
know the really good Minnesota
excluding
basketball
Minnesota,
team.
they all of them are like plus 10 gold, 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 silver. Um, and he was on the national scene for a really long time, and he was a relevant prospect for a really long time. And
Mm-hmm.
there's really only one guy who's been like relevant for a really long time. But a big part of that is his dad was an NBA player. His granddad was also like an All American, and he is a decent player, but obviously the early parts of the NCAA season have not really backed up some of that early ranking, and really, he never really had like dominant or really productive sessions relative to his peers. And that's DJ Wagner, right? He wasn't great with Team USA.
Right,
He
right.
wasn't great EYBL, and most of the Camden events he wasn't like super 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 good. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a bunch of players who don't have like these plus priors, right? That okay, K was on the scene after he went to Montverde. He was on the scene, right? Everyone knew who Kay Cunningham was once he had transferred, once he had left Texas. Um, everyone knew who Jalen Green was. Well, even a little bit before prolific prep, like he's one of the most famous high school players ever. Same kind of
Right,
applies for
right.
same kind of applies for Mobley. And then in the next class, the same definitely applies for Chet. He again one of the most famous high school players ever. Um, Paulo is a little bit different just because I think COVID kind of put a wrench on
Mm-hmm.
um, him because they couldn't go out of state in Seattle. I think it kind of put a wrench on his hype. But I do think that Paulo is still definitely a relevant name on draft Twitter at the very least.
Oh yeah.
Jaden Hardy, etc., etc. In this class, it's just like the last class was just like plus priors everywhere. You know, Lively was RSCI number one. He went like 12. Um, Nick Smith Jr. was RSCI, or was Nick Smith Jr. RSCI number one? One of them was.
Lively was number one, but Nick Smith was number one on another service. I forget which.
On one of them, and obviously he went 27. He went 27, and these guys, you know, Lively dominated with Team Finale. Nick Smith Jr. dominated with Bradley Bill Elite. And Scoot had been on the scene for a good bit now, but certainly the 2 years before, Wembanyama had been on the scene forever, basically, since he was 15, 16. So there's just like the comparison I think that we make cognitively is like, I don't know this player. I'm not well informed of this player because they didn't really have illustrious high school careers outside of Holland. They weren't EYBL superstars. And right now, they're all in archetypes that aren't the cutest, like aren't the loveliest, aren't the easiest to project, I should say. So
Yeah,
I think we kind of faded because of that. But I also think it's weak, like in comparison to other classes. But I don't think it's like the worst class that we've seen in a while. Like I wouldn't say this is the worst top of the class than like 2015.
Yeah, that's a really good way of phrasing it, and I haven't really heard somebody phrase it that way. It's specifically like there's a lot of players here who either because of different circumstances, they may have unique skill sets in weird archetypes or whatever, and they may not have the track record of adapting and dominating that past top picks have. But that's not to say that there's not pathways to them being really great. It's just you can't be a team that just stumbles on the fifth pick and just plugs and plays some player in, and regardless of who you have, you're going to be fine. Like there's a little bit more onus on front offices to really consider, like, we have a player who has skills, but are they going to flourish here or not? And that is really, really fascinating to me. It's something I've kind of wanted to write about from the opposite side, and I will at some point, which is like the NBA side. And what I mean by that is there's only 3 teams tanking right now, and there's more parity right now in the league than ever before. The combination of like players playing longer into their careers and young players being ready to contribute because of crazy drafts like last year means there's less roster spots that are purely for a player to just like fuck around on the court and make mistakes and shit. Most development now, you have to earn your minutes. It's very rare to see a player, no matter how high they're picked, get minutes and they're a zero on one end of the court. It just doesn't happen. Like even someone like Dyson Daniels, who's like, I consider him basically a zero on offense, but he's like an absolutely like stunning, incredible defender, well beyond his years. So he's as good as you could possibly be at his age on the other end. And he's like, that's what it takes to make up for being basically not helpful on offense on a team that's pretty good. So it's already hard for good picks in archetypes that are a little easier to envision. It's already hard for those guys to find minutes. So that's why I think it's going to be really scary for GMs and front offices in charge of the draft this year, because especially in the top 10, because the top 10 is supposed to be theoretically where you get players who are surer picks. And, maybe the fit isn't as clean, but so what? You can still take Jarris Walker and he'll complement you of your guys eventually because he's a two-way player and he has good size and all that shit. But in reality, all of a sudden your team is the Pacers and you putting up 140 points a game, and now you're not sure if Jarvis Walker fits with this high octane shit, and you're good now, and you don't have time for an 18-year-old, right? No matter how good they are. So now you might be on the look out for trading for OG or Pascal or someone like that, or Kyle Kuzma. So like it's really hard right now to get minutes for talented players, and for these players like you mentioned, like Ron Holland and Buzelis, the two stars of the Ignite, those guys got lots of talent, but you can't just plug them in mindlessly. And I'm not saying that's what teams do, but like I think a lot of times throughout the league, teams with good reason have been like, I'm gonna bet on the talent and we'll figure out the fit a little bit later. And that's gonna be really hard with this class. And that means there might be some players who could otherwise have ended up good, who end up being like second contract guys, if not just like bums straight up in the top 10. And it wouldn't be super surprising, right? And it's like, and what does that mean for like trading around the draft, like trading in? Are these GMs gonna be looking to trade out because they're shook? I have no fucking idea. So it's gonna be a wild draft from that perspective. And I agree. I think it's one of those where for good drafting front offices that are really conscious about these nuances, I think there's going to be opportunities there for them to, if they know a guy who fits in with what they're specifically trying to do, they can trade with some of these GMs that get a little bit nervous that are in like picking 8, 9, 10, 11, right? Like the Knicks have 2 picks. Maybe they trade up. They've tried to do that a couple of times. They tried to trade up for Trey Murphy, but couldn't do it. Well, they tried to do it with Ivy, with Trey Murphy. They tried to do it with Maxey. They've tried to do it a couple of times throughout the years, but haven't really been able to pull it off. Of course, they have more stuff to trade now than they did back then. But anyway, my point is like it's definitely like weird trade proposal season. It's going to be that leading into the draft for some teams, but other teams might just be like, fuck this, I'm trying to just trade out or trade back so I have a less pressure spot. We already got 9 of our roster spots accounted for, including lots of young guys. Like I'm trying to just deal with the devil I have here rather than look like a fool or something. So it'll be real interesting. And then we haven't even talked about like several teams having lots of the picks, which makes it even more insane.
This is based on where our teams are. This isn't even necessarily where the conversation was supposed to go, but I kind of thought that was relevant to like understanding the 2024 class, where
it is.
I think there is a quickness to be like, this is bad. Okay, maybe this is bad, but what if it's just weird? And what if those two things don't necessarily correlate? That's my only thing.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And I think when most people say this is bad, what they kind of mean is, even if they don't know it, is this isn't easy to stumble into a good player, which there's overlap there, but it's not exactly the same thing. So like the weird COVID draft, like that was weird. And guess what happened? You have a bunch of fucking all NBA all-star or quasi all-stars coming up in the second half of that draft because it was weird and other teams took advantage of that. Maxey, Quickly, Bane, Hallie, like McDaniel. I'm missing. There's like 10 other guys. It was like it was insane, and that was that was probably the best analog to this year. Not necessarily because of like the lack of player quality, quote unquote, but just like the general weirdness, like you said, for different reasons. That year it was because of COVID and everything, but the more I think about it and just hear you talk about it like that, I'm like, I kind of feel, and this brings me to the Heat and the Knicks. It makes me feel good because my team doesn't have the pressure of a top 10 pick, but we can still take advantage, which the Knicks have been historically, recently at least, pretty good at, like with like Quickly and Grimes, and they've been good on the margins and stuff like that. It's their top picks where they've ironically just struggled through the years, but like middle of the draft, back end of the draft, they've been pretty good since Walt Perrin has been here running the show. So the Heat will likely be picking in the back half. It's just y'all just have your own pick, right? You don't have anybody else's, I don't think.
Yeah, just our 2024 first round.
Yeah, so for now, one bite at the apple, barring some unforeseen trade. We can just hit quickly on, like, are there any guys who, I'll say this with the disclaimer that like every mock draft I see from ESPN or whoever, like the order changes wildly. So guys we talk about today in a month could be like in the lottery for all I fucking know. So disclaimer for the listeners,
Yeah,
but like, are
the
there
check
any?
might hit. The check might hit a certain person's pocket.
Exactly. Those mid-major checks cash out a little bit later, so you gotta wait till it heats up outside. But yeah, are there any other players, any players who are outside of those like name brand, like not Matas, not Ron Holland, not Sar, who you're like, they might got the versatility or the touch or like the understanding of how to play off ball and all that shit that like the Miami Heat like?
I think one target is somebody who I like outside of the Heat in a position of need, in like a backup center, and like somebody who does have like good touch and good movement skills and a body that, like you mentioned, strength. One thing that I forgot to mention when I talked about things that the Heat like in a prospect is like they're willing, and this goes beyond just the prospect. This is like especially UDFA because that's a big part of the
Mm-hmm.
appeal to the Heat. Is somebody with like somebody who's a project, physically, right? Somebody, okay, we're gonna work on your movement skills, or okay, we're gonna work on your body, or we're gonna work
We're
on them
gonna
making
give
jump
you
shots.
that good HGH.
and they end up, and they end up better movers, whether that's Gabe Vincent, whether that's Max Strus, who recently left. So I think,
Duncan Robinson, yo, I be seeing
yeah,
pictures of
yeah,
him, and he looks swole out here now,
Duncan,
and he moves well.
and like he's handling better, etc., etc. So
Right.
I think Daron Holmes is definitely somebody who um I would look at if I were the Heat. Um, I think he kind of has a combination of like ball skills and length and touch and like a little bit of secondary passing that could add punch to the Heat second unit in due time. Right, we kind of already have a big bet like that in Orlando Robinson, but I think I
Mm-hmm.
would I think I would be a lot more willing to put faith in Deron just because Deron moves a lot better than Orlando, and he's a lot
Mm-hmm.
more explosive of a mover. I think he led the NCAA in dunks last year, or he was certainly. Or no, that was probably Zach Edey, or he was like certainly he was like up there,
He
and
dunks a lot, and he dunks the shit out the ball.
yeah, his arms are super long. He obviously the shooting is a part of his appeal, and like general spacing is a big part of what the Heat want to do. Obviously picking pops from the top of the key, or against like let's say Tibbs patent
Mm-hmm.
ice coverage at times, even though you guys aren't like super as heavy ice as like the Celtics were or the Bulls were. If the
Yeah.
Knicks are running ice coverage, float into the free throw line and knock it down, that dotted jumper is something that's valuable and something Orlando hasn't shown that he can do consistently. And Thomas Bryant is kind of not playable on the other end at all, and one of
Right.
the least enjoyable players ever, even though he can do that, right? So finding somebody who can kind of do that, and they have no projectable skills on the defensive end where the hand-eye coordination that helps him with the touch, I think helps him with like ball tracking and like blocking shots. The strength is a pretty major concern, especially in his core, and I think balance can be an issue at times. But that's where you know heat, strength, and conditioning, and baby steroids, like you said, can help. So um, I think Deron Holmes is definitely one of my first Heat targets. I actually wanted us to trade into the second round and see if we had a shot at him last year. But obviously he exited the draft because he wasn't getting the best feedback. I don't think he's valued in a draft very much. So whether that's a second pick or the Heat really don't care about where somebody is expected to go or what's the most valuable time to take them. Like if the Heat had a positive eval on Duran and they had like the 22nd pick and he was projected to go 58, they would take him 22nd. Like if he was number one on their board, he would get taken early. And you seen that with Hami. You seen that with Tyler. A lot of people called Tyler a reach at the time. People hated the Bam pick. People forget that the Bam pick was like so slammed on here, and I think part of it was like not necessarily being used that right at Kentucky, but a lot of it was just like where he was supposed to go or considered to go versus where he went. So yeah,
it's also classic like Kentucky weirdness, right? Where I think people now like know better than to like, they always know a little more might be under the hood now than they thought. But back then, people were like, what? Just this, rim running
big. Like they thought he was a normal big. And it's like I was super young when this happened, but I remember sneaking and watching like his game against Chino Hills. And I was like, he can kind of pass. Why didn't he do this at Kentucky? Interesting.
Yeah. I remember I definitely rated him too low. But I remember being like, oh, he played on like the weird Chino Hills team. Like there might be some stuff there, but I just didn't know what the fuck to do with that information about that team at all in general back then. It was so like out there. But yeah, 100%. Deron Holmes is someone like I don't really know what to do with him. I gotta dig into his shot more, but like, yeah, he's the kind of player who I could totally see the Heat taking, and then everybody being like, "Oh, like this guy can knock down a spot up three, and he's like fucking chiseled now, and he's a great rim protector who moves well." Like, why was everyone asleep at the wheel? And it's like, no, you just like, he's not a shiny object who's plug and play. And there's a lot of rim running center prospects every year now who are really good. So it's like, what differentiates him? Well, the team that picks. That could be a really valid differentiator. It doesn't always have to be the player themselves. So that's a really good example of how that might go down. I've always gotten like some pushback from Knicks fans whenever I like a center prospect, just because, we've had Mitch and Ihart and Tibbs and 48 minutes of big centers and no stretch fives, and Julius never plays the five. So it's like, especially we were starved for guard play for years. So it's like, no, don't waste your valuable draft pick on a fucking center, Prez. Like, we need to take more guards and stuff. But I think now that our roster's more settled, Knicks fans are a little more open-minded about who they might take. I know we've been going for a bit here, so I'll close this out. Can you give me quick, like, one sentence on like three other guys who, if you were the GM, you'd be on the lookout for them for the Heat late in the first?
I would probably say Wooga Poplar. Flexible, projectable shot, stocks. That's something that the Heat don't normally look for. He's not necessarily a type of archetype that the Heat like have normally coveted. In terms of like body type, he's probably the most similar, like Jay Rich on our team currently, but he is definitely somebody.
Is he from Miami? I know he plays there.
I don't think so.
Oh, I was gonna say bring him home, but I mean, he is close enough.
He did play for Miami. He does have the touch stuff. He is a multi-year guy, which I think helps for them. Yeah, I would say Wooga Poplar is somebody that I would look at. Trying to think of guys that might declare. Let's go. Like, I think just to keep along with like the big theme, I would definitely say like Osa is somebody with like decent touch indicators and is a 5 with like good ball tracking and can move really well. Those should be targets, and there's a lot of those in the draft. Whether it's him, whether it's Bona, Ezon is kind of falling out of like teams aren't as much in love with him as they were before. But somebody with that kind of relevant skill set, if you can get him in, the mid or the early second round, and in terms of like multi-year guy, shooter, like great touch indicators, I would definitely say like Jackson Robinson is somebody that the Heat should look for.
Jackson Robinson is literally like the player I want the most on the Knicks. Like I haven't made my Knicks specific draft board yet, but by the end of the cycle, I will have made Knicks Twitter fall in love with this man. That's like my one goal.
Yeah, movement shooter with long arms. Like that. Obviously, there's a lot more to dive into, but those type of guys who are movement shooters with like decent athletic tools,
Right.
his are a little bit better than decent, but solid athletes, and he's like flexible. You don't really see that for like a skinny, tall person, like being really flexible and a really good shooter. Like that's just a simple sell, right? And I think there's a little bit of scarcity in that. There aren't really like movement shooters in this class. Maybe you could argue Risa Share at the top. Maybe you can argue like Melvin Agensa. I might have butchered that last name, but there aren't as many like movement shooter types, and he's definitely one of those. So scarcity value, tall, long shooter. So
he's one of those players who's like, we talked about guys with kind of like very specific. They need a certain set of circumstances to flourish. But Jackson's pretty straightforward. He's like, nope, you just put him on your bench and he comes in and he fucking shoots a lot of threes and occasionally gets cuts or dunks in transition. Like because he's athletic. Like it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Are there any like Knicks specific targets that you can give some short words on?
I'm still thinking about it, but like the Knicks like guys who score a lot. Every player they picked has scored just a shit ton, like in terms of like per minute, per 100 possessions, per 40 possessions, per 36 minutes, whatever measure you want. Like Deuce, Grimes, Obi, Quickly, even like Rokas overseas. Like all these guys just are like score first guys who just filled it up before they got to the NBA. They like pull-up shooters, but I think that might just be because they've taken a lot of guards. They certainly haven't taken any guards who don't pull-up shoot. They like guys who are strong. They have not drafted a young 18 or 19-year-old since RJ Barrett. I don't include Trevor Keels because I'm assuming that was just a favor to an agent or something. I don't know what happened there.
Would Dylan Jones kind of fit that description?
I haven't really dug into Dylan Jones that much, so you tell me, man. I gotta put him on my list.
I think he's kind of like, just in terms of the sell, he's not really the best athlete, but he's kind of like he's a guy with like a lot of usage right now, scoring the ball a lot, good intermediate game, can shoot the three ball.
I know he's strong.
Yeah, he's like really strong for the most part. Like he has a really big frame, and he's also relatively flexible, but the explosiveness is on the negative side, and the movement skills defensively are on the negative side. It's kind of a similar sell to like, I'm trying to remember who did the Grizzlies draft in 22 other than LaRavia?
Roddy?
Yes, it's kind of like a similar sell to like David Roddy, where it's like, okay, this guy has like Jones is a good passer, Jones is a good scorer, Jones is like a good driver, at getting to a spot, not necessarily getting all the way. But this is all in like a creator role, and he has some movement concerns. How do we, scale that back? I think like not even necessarily making a aesthetic comp to them, just in terms of like the sell of what their offensive usage means on the next level. So I think maybe I mean he's not the tallest though, but he does kind of fit the scores a lot. Hits pull-ups, is strong.
I mean the whole Knicks team is like not tall relative to their positions except for their centers, so I don't think that would be much of an issue. And I'm looking at the other thing I didn't get to that I forgot is like the Knicks are a bunch of fucking nerds. Like they're one of the most analytics cognizant teams in the league, and like almost every player they take is like
productive,
like, wacko college.
That's the first key in Kieran, right?
Huh? Yeah, maybe. I don't. It's been a while since I read it, but yeah, I forget what stupid acronym I came up to make it fit. But yeah, this guy, like, I haven't looked at his stats since like the very beginning of the season, and like, holy shit, like his numbers are crazy. So yeah, I'm gonna have to dig in on Dylan Jones, because he's clearly out here hooping, and anybody who's out here hooping, putting up like double-digit BPMs, and is old enough to drink, and also can like bench themselves 20 times is probably going to be high on the Knicks draft board. So I'm going to check that out. And he's 6'6", which is like, the Knicks got enough guards. They need wings. So that kind of works too. Cool. All right. Well, we ended this with you putting me on to a possible pairing pick. So that was a pleasant but not unexpected surprise. Because that's why I follow you on Twitter, is to learn shit like that. So thank you, Eli, for joining us on this pod for almost an hour. Very generous with your time. And like I said at the top, y'all can find Eli on Twitter at Flawless Like Eli. You can find the pod, the Culture Chatter pod, on Twitter and wherever you get your podcasts. And Eli, I don't know if you want to plug anything that you got coming out, or the pod, or anything, like, feel free to just let folks know like what you got going on, if there's anything, or whatever.
Not really. Articles on the way, probably, about this class. Maybe a Ron Holland article soon, or maybe not as soon. You never know. Trying to get back into that sphere, but nothing really. Thank you for letting me come on, etc.
Yeah, man, you got it. This was tons of fun for me. I know, like, that topic that we had, and like that discussion we had in the middle of the pod, that's just the kind of thing that is so much easier to get into in this format as opposed to tweets and DMs. So this was fucking exactly what I hoped for. So thank you, man. This was great. I have no doubt that this will help get people excited for this class. Yeah, that's what we got for you this week. I know we had a long gap, listeners, between the first episode and the second episode of Draft Strickland this season, and that's because it was the holidays, and then I fucking got COVID. But we're gonna try to get every 2 weeks. We're gonna try to get this train back on schedule, so we can get a couple of episodes under our belt before we get to March Madness and all that. So lock in with us, tap in. We're going to be getting into it, as the Knicks pass this trade deadline, and the players throughout the country and in other leagues around the world begin kind of solidifying their rank, and hopefully we get some consensus in this crazy draft, and then we'll be able to figure out who the Knicks will take. And until next time, it's me, your boy Prez. You can find me at _Presidente on Twitter. You can find me on the Strickland writing stuff. Go check us out, and we will see you next time.